Hello, guys and gals, and here's a new series that we are starting up. Pandora's Genes got over with, and I can't really find the sequel anywhere, so I'm going to replace it with Neptune One is Missing. And this is a book I found quite by accident. Of course, I've learned that basically nothing is accident these days, and it's really a neat book. One of my favorites. Anyways, I'm going to read it. We're going to go over the copyright information, though. If I can find it, there. It says here, copyright 1969 by Hugh Walters. First American edition. Wow, this is a first edition book. All rights reserved, including the right to... The right to reproduce this book or portion thereof in any form. So, anyways, we're going to do that. Anyways, we are going to start with chapter 1, which is where everybody should start. Now, this is probably part of it's part of a multi-part story, but this is the first one I read, so it has significance to me. It says, Chapter 1, Chris Godfrey and his 3 companions were dead. The shock of this bulletin hit countless thousands who had been following the adventures of the fearless quartet. Ever since their spaceship had blasted off for the planet Neptune, regular bulletins had kept the world informed of their progress. The sudden announcement that the ship and its crew had been destroyed seemed unbelievable. But the cold official words coming from the Secretary General of the United Nations finally convinced their multitude of admirers that Chris, Maury, Serge, and Tony would never be seen again. Briefly, the official statement said that during the previous day, all signals from Neptune One, as the ship was called, had ceased. Even more serious, the radar tracking stations had reported that Neptune One had apparently broken up into a number of small pieces. The disaster seemed to be complete. Shocked viewers and listeners hung over their sets, anxious for more news. But apart from repeats of the official announcement, nothing was forthcoming. It was some hours later that the radio and television networks began to broadcast accounts of the 4 astronauts' past adventures. Most of that worldwide audience knew at least some of the exploits of the world's most experienced space travelers. They remembered how many years ago it now seemed these young men had been the first to establish a base on the moon. Later, they had visited a number of planets in our solar system, including Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each expedition had been dangerous. Many times, the lives of the explorers had seemed lost, but each time they had survived thanks to their endurance, skill, and matchless courage. It seemed incredible that they would not return to Earth once more in triumph, and that the dazzling picture of the 4 young astronauts had been wiped out. Inevitably, the usual controversy started and raged universally. Should the lives of the 4 young men have been risked on this expedition? Hadn't man proceeded far enough in his exploration of the universe? What was the value of a journey to Neptune anyway? Though the arguments were flung back and forth, the 3 people who felt the loss of the astronauts most deeply had no doubts. They knew that Chris and his friends were only happy when they were facing the unknown. What they were trying to when they were trying to push human knowledge into regions where it had never penetrated before. Sir George Benson, the distinguished scientist and director of the United States Exploration Agency, had been Chris Godfrey's greatest friend. They had met when Chris was still at school, and it was Benson who had recruited the boy to be one of the world's first space explorers. It was Benson, too, who had been responsible for all the later journeys of Chris and his friends in his capacity as the world's greatest expert on rocket propulsion. He had planned their many expeditions in minute details. Now he had failed them. Something which perhaps he should have foreseen had happened, and he would never see his 4 friends again. Sir George's deputy was Mr. William Gillanders. Billy and his friends... Billy to his friends. Next to his chief. Oh, next to his chief, the tall Australian had been most clearly associated with Chris, Maury, Serge, and Tony. Over many years of work together and through many crises, his affection and admiration for the quartet had grown. Now he was filled with grief that they had perished somewhere out in the depths of space. But if Sir George and Billy had developed a friendship for because of their professional association, there was one man to whom they had come to mean much in a personal capacity. That was Whiskers Greatrex, the ex-RAF pilot with the large mustache. He had been recruited as guide, philosopher, and friend to the four young men whenever they had been training for another venture into the unknown. He had helped them through innumerable crises, and he'd known them perhaps better than they'd known themselves. It was about a fortnight after the disaster that Sir George, Billy, and Whiskers were together in the Greatrex home. Mrs. Greatrex had written urgent letters to the other two begging them to come and see her husband and to try to cheer him up, though they had little to be cheerful about. Benson and Mr. Gillanders had agreed. They had both canceled important engagements to spend the weekend with their old friend. We all knew it would happen sometime, Billy was saying, and they knew it too. How many times have we tried to dissuade them from making another trip? Every time, answered Sir George. But they were dedicated to their job. I've often wondered if I should have ordered them to be grounded, but of course I had no excuse. No, they were certainly the most brilliant space pilots we had, Billy agreed. They were pathfinders, Whiskers declared, rousing himself. He had used the title given to World War II pilots, who blazed the trail for others. Whiskers himself had been on several such missions. It's true, agreed Sir George, and you'll remember, Whiskers, that the pathfinders had the most dangerous job. It was much easier for those who followed once the trail had been plotted. Our friends have blazed the trail to the planets. We all know, Billy imposed, that each of them would have chosen to end this way rather than in a hospital bed or in a motor accident. They accepted the risks openly and cheerfully. There should be no regrets. You're right, of course, Whiskers agreed, but we shall miss them. Benny, have you any theories about what happened? The only explanation I can give is that Neptune One collided with a wandering asteroid. But as the odds against this are billions to one, I can't really accept it, the scientist replied. Apart from that, I haven't a clue. How did you know about the disaster? asked Whiskers. Well, as you know, the ship blasted off from the Cape 11 weeks ago, Sir George began. The plan was that the crew should keep awake for 10 days and then would all undergo hypothermia for the long voyage. As his two friends were talking, Billy Gillander thought of the wonders of hypothermia. This was a process of freezing the human body so that all life in it ceased. After any given period, the body could be restored to its normal temperature and the person revived. He would have no idea how much time had passed, whether hours, weeks, or months. Developed originally for surgical reasons, hypothermia had opened vast possibilities for space travel until some means of traveling faster than light were found. A journey to the nearest star took many years. Even voyages to some of our own planets took many months, and no conscious astronaut could survive for this length of time without being put to sleep by hypothermia. No crew could withstand the psychological and physical strains of being confined in a spaceship for so long. Now, to them, voyages only lasted the length of time that they were conscious at the beginning and at the end of the expedition. The long period in between just didn't count. Chris and his crew had all undergone gone hypothermia during their journey to Saturn, and Chris had often teased Whiskers about how he'd aged while he had been away. As for themselves, the four young astronauts felt little older than when they had begun their long journey. Indeed, as all biological processes had been suspended, there had been endless arguments about whether they were physically or legally older. Some interesting possibilities had been put forward. While Sir George continued talking to Whiskers, Mr. Gillanders speculated about the potential of this freezing process. By this means, a crew could be frozen and sent on a voyage lasting hundreds of years. At the end, they would be defrosted, and it would seem to them that no time had elapsed. However, when they returned to Earth using the same process, they would find the world very different, and many generations of their descendants would have lived and died. Billy gave up trying to work out the results of such a fantastic situation. The launch was near perfect, Sir George was saying. After going into orbit around Earth at a precisely calculated moment, the rocket motors were restarted and Neptune One began its long journey to the planet. Chris reported that all was well, and further reports came in at regular intervals. The flight path was piloted by our chain of tracking stations all around the Earth. Only minor adjustments were necessary, and these were carried out efficiently by the crew. Chris and the others were all right? Perfectly. Of course, they were beginning to get bored by the end of the 10 days. I had the impression that they were looking forward to their long sleep. We had, of course, a recording of every message they sent. Since the disaster, we've studied them minutely, and there isn't a single clue that anything was wrong. At the prearranged time, the four of them entered the special compartment designed to operate the hypothermia process automatically. We received a last message from Chris that they were all settled on their couches and waiting for the freezing to begin. He even joked and said that he hoped I hadn't grown a long beard by the time they got back. It was my job to monitor the signals from then on, said Billy. There were two kinds. The first was the continuous signal sent out automatically by one of the transmitters. We used the signal to check the direction, velocity, and position of the ship. A second transmitter broadcast data every 3 hours. This told us temperature, radiation, and interstellar dust conditions through which the ship was passing. As you know, the transmitters are powered by atomic energy and are 100% reliable. They broadcast for years if required. There isn't any question of a failure. Besides, it is inconceivable that both transmitters would have developed faults at the same time. Whiskers was listening gloomily. Most of what Sir George and Billy had told him he knew already. Deep within him, there still burned a little flame of hope that perhaps Sir George had made a mistake, or that there was an explanation for the interrupted signals. Chris and the others had some incredible escapes. Sir George went on. Shortly after midnight GMT, that is just after 7:30 in the morning local time, our tracking stations at Singapore lost the continuous signal. It so happened that one of the lecturers from Singapore University, Mr. Murat, was on duty at the time. Naturally, Murat's first thought was that a fault had developed in his apparatus. In such an event, the procedure laid down is that the next tracking station, in this case Perth, Australia, must be alerted and asked to take over. This Murat did, but even while he was still speaking to his opposite number at Perth, he was told that the tracking station there was unable to pick up the signal. It would have been too much of a coincidence if both stations had developed faults simultaneously. For a quick check, both of them tuned into one of the satellites, and signals were perfect. The obvious conclusion was that Neptune One had stopped transmitting. Billy Gilliander took up the story. I was having lunch when the news came through, but I never finished it. I rushed to main control at the Cape and alerted every tracking and scanning station around the globe. Even then, I hoped it was a temporary fault with Neptune's continuous transmitter, or that the signal might have been interrupted by an uncharted belt of radiation. We shall get the data signal. Oh, wait. Or that the signal might have been interrupted by an uncharted belt of radiation. We shall get the data signal in 90 minutes time, I thought, but I had to admit that I was getting alarmed. Did you get the 3-hourly signal? Whiskers asked. No. No, as the time for the reception drew near, we were all very steamed up. We couldn't believe that the trouble could be anything other than a most unusual fault in Neptune One's transmitter. The radio boys were more pessimistic. They declared that their transmitters were completely reliable and couldn't develop a fault. But I tried to believe they were exaggerating. Well, the moment came and passed, and there was no signal. The data transmitter on the ship was also completely silent. That did it as far as the radio boys were concerned. They had no doubt but that a major disaster had overtaken Neptune One. We were still reluctant to assume the worst, Benson resumed, so we sent out the radar pulse that we developed specifically for this long-distance tracking. By the time the ship was just over 700 million miles away, about a quarter of its journey done. It takes a radar pulse about 1 hour to travel that distance, and the same time to come back. Those 2 hours were some of the longest in my life. What happened? Whiskers demanded. When the pulse did come back, it revealed not one object, but several. Instead of sending back a single reflection, Neptune One was reflecting a number of separate objects. The inference was plain. The ship was broken up into pieces, each returning its radar pulse. Sir George answered. And you've no idea what caused the breakup? None. We didn't know whether the cause was internal or external. We couldn't even tell how large are the pieces that are left. At that distance, it is just possible to get a reading, but it reveals no detail, Benson said. So in view of the silence of both transmitters and the fragmentation of the ship's radar blip, we can only conclude that Neptune One has been destroyed, and that Chris, Serge, Tony, and Maury have perished with it. There seemed nothing more to say. Checking. Chapter 2. Some six months before this, Sir George Benson sent for his favorite crew. As director of the United Nations Exploration Agency, he had just been given the green light for launching a manned probe to the planet Neptune. Of course, there was only one crew he would choose for this excursion into regions of the solar system as yet unknown. He knew they would be excited at the prospect of this new adventure. They would never have forgiven him if he'd passed them over. But now he wished he had. Perhaps that was unfair. Benson corrected himself hurriedly. Of course, he wouldn't condemn knowingly any of his young men or women astronauts to death. It would have been better not to have requested the Neptune go ahead, or at least to have confined it to still more unmanned probes. Still, it's easy to be wise after the event, he realized. Sir George remembered vividly how the 4 astronauts came clattering into his London office in Theobald's Road. It was barely 9 o'clock in the morning, and his secretaries were just getting the covers off their typewriters. He'd sent Chris a telegram the previous afternoon. It had simply read, "New venture planned. Are you interested?" As he'd known it would. The answer came from the way they were hurrying along the corridor towards his office door. Without waiting for a secretary to announce them, Chris and the others rushed into the inner sanctum. "Where are we off to this time?" Chris burst out before the scientist could speak. "Steady on," Sir George smiled. "Aren't you even going to wish me good morning?" Chris apologized on behalf of all of them. "Now calm down and take seats," Sir George said. "I won't tell you a thing until you've settled down." Never before had the four young men seated themselves so quickly. They even managed to remain silent during the protracted pause while Sir George kept them waiting. At last he spoke. "We've got permission to make our next shot," he told them. "UNEXA, that is the UNEXA, has passed the budget and given us the go-ahead. We're to start work at once. Are you interested?" Where is it to?" Tony asked. "So, you want to know full details before you decide, do you?" Benson smiled. "Well, I can't blame you." "Of course not, Uncle George," Chris clipped in hurriedly. "Wherever it is, we intend to go. Don't we, chaps?" The reply left the director in no doubt about their enthusiasm for the next adventure, no matter where it led them. It was no more than he had expected, for he had known the four too long to have any doubt about their courage and curiosity. "This expedition will be to Neptune. Now are you quite sure you want to go?" Sir George asked. "Neptune," Maury explained. "Why Neptune?" "You mean, why have we left out Uranus?" "Because at the moment Neptune is more favorably placed," Benson replied. "It will be several years before we could have another shot at it." "Have you roughed out the program yet?" Chris asked. "Only at the barest outline," Sir George replied briefly. "You will blast off from the Cape, get into orbit, then we shall start you on your way. You'll switch over to the iron motor a bit later, and then for the next 10 days or so you'll be helping to put the ship on course. After that you can go to sleep until you're nearly there. You will orbit the planet several times, even descending to take samples of the upper atmosphere if you wish to. Then you'll break orbit and reverse the plan of your outward journey for your trip back home." How long will the expedition last?" Serge wanted to know. "Just over a year. That is for us earthbound mortals," the scientist smiled. "To you, it will only seem like a month." "I thought it would be longer," said Tony. "It took us 18 months to get to Saturn and back." "Yes, but there have been improvements since then. The ion drive of the spaceship that took you to Saturn had a thrust of only 1/10 G. I think that's a 10 or 1/16 G. But now the ion drive can produce 1/8 G. "So we shall gain 11 months on you," Tony grinned. "Counting training and other trips, that would make nearly 3 years. Okay, we're still doing good time-wise. "Yes, you'll also miss another birthday," Sir George laughed. "But don't worry, we'll keep a record of them for you." Then they all launched into one of their favorite arguments about how old they actually were. Still their ages stand still while they were under hypothermia. Or should they be reckoned by Earth time, like other people's? Would their insurance policies mature according to the date on Earth, or would they run on for the extra time that the astronauts had been asleep? What was more important, when would they reach 40, the compulsory retirement age for spacemen? Sir George remembered how at last he'd had to send them from his office after giving them strict instructions that they were to report to Farnborough next morning. That had meant that they were to make an immediate start on their training, for the shot was timed for a very few weeks ahead. Whiskers Greatrex recalled how he'd again been appointed to act as guide, philosopher, and friend to the four young men during the strenuous period of training and briefing. He left his country cottage happily, for there was nothing that he enjoyed more than playing the part of his excited exploration. Than playing a part in this exciting exploration of the solar system. He'd been at Farnborough to meet the quartet along with his old friend Squadron Leader Lambert, the chief medical officer. They had discussed the new expedition enthusiastically, for though they all knew the incredible risks the crew would have to run, the risk that the crew would have to run, Chris and his companions had faced such situations countless times before. Whiskers groaned as he thought of the exhilarating days of their training. He'd had to keep a constant eye on his proteges. Rides on the great centrifuge had been child's play to them for the number of their previous rides, to say nothing of the actual launchings were legion. Yet training regulations laid down that each of them must spend so much time being whirled around by this vast machine. They also had they had to spend periods in hot and cold chambers to test out the insulation of their suits. They had been in low pressure chambers where the atmospheric pressure had been reduced to almost nil. A mock-up of this space capsule had been used to familiarize them with the complicated instruments, though as the cabin was going to be the same as several previous ones. This was scarcely necessary. Finally, they each had a short spell of hypothermia just to make sure they remembered all the details. They visited the London Planetarium in Baker Street. There, with the help of the instrument and lectures by prominent astronomers, they learned a great deal about the planet they were to visit. Neptune is the solar system's furthest, but one of Neptune is the solar planet furthest, but one from the sun. Only little Pluto circles on a more distant orbit. Neptune is large though, not as vast as the great planet Jupiter and Saturn. Its diameter is 27,600 miles, less than a third of Jupiter's, and slightly over a third of Saturn's, but it is twice as dense as its larger companions. We're going to have to stop that here for now, and we will learn more about Neptune when we get back. We've been reading from Neptune Was Missing. It is a book by Hugh Walters. And if you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me anyway, or if you want to join the Discord server, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.